I was born in Southern California and raised in a Roman Catholic family, actually. And my parents paid for me to go to Catholic school. I went to Catholic school for the first 6 years of my life. But it kind of started about the second grade. As far as I can remember, I loved God. As far as I can remember back, when I was a child, I loved God. And so I was eating all this stuff up, going to Catholic school, and we got nuns and all of that kind of business there. So then, but when I got in the second grade and I was preparing for my first communion, all of a sudden I realized, my parents took us to church every Sunday, but they never participated in communion. They never went up for communion. So I sat with my mom and I said, Mom, how come you and Dad never go up for communion? And my mom told me, she said, I was divorced when I was young, before I met your dad. And so the church never accepted our marriage. And she said we were told that we would have to split up, and we couldn't be married if we wanted to be right with the Catholic Church. And your dad and I won't do that. As a second grader, I was a second grader when I heard these things, and as a second grader, I knew what that meant in the Catholic faith. You're going to hell, Mom. And so, and I also knew the shame of that, and so that continued to kind of wash over me. In fact, I think that I was really raised in an atmosphere of shame and guilt. By the time I became 11 years old or so, I was pretty frustrated about my relationship with God, because I kept faltering in the ideas of this religion. And about the time that I hit teens, I was done. And I begged my parents, I'm not going to church anymore. And my life just started taking a dive. I started going away from God and towards drugs, towards things that really weren't the best for me. About my junior year of high school was one of my worst years. A lot of drugs. My brother had been in the Navy, came back from Vietnam, and I'd get loaded every morning before I went to school. I mean, it was bad. It was a bad scene. But God was there reaching out to me. I remember a couple of moments in my life when I knew I had really failed God and something inside of me died. It just felt like I was dead inside. But I kept going on and going on. When I became a senior in high school, my brother was living with a gal, and they had encountered a cult in Hollywood. It was a Jesus People cult during that time. And my brother got involved in that cult and just totally disappeared. I remember when his girlfriend said to me, she said, Steve, Tony's gone. He's disappeared. And so I quizzed her and kept quizzing her, where do you think he went? Where do you think he went? And she said, well, there is this place in Hollywood, that he really was attracted to. I think he might have gone there. And so I jumped in my car and drove to Hollywood to find him. And I ended up in this huge house somewhere in Hollywood. I was just off the boulevard there, somewhere in Hollywood, with like 6 or 7 guys sitting around me telling me I was going to hell. And all they did was make me mad. But inside, I knew they were right. I just didn't know how to get out of this. I spent most of my senior year sort of wrestling with all of that. And the last scene that I remember in my senior year was, I have a picture that is engraved in my mind that was taken of me when I was graduating from high school. Standing in my parents' home, surrounded by relatives. My girlfriend was right next to me. And I was looking real lost because my girlfriend, who was right next to me, was 4.5 months pregnant. I'm a senior in high school with a pregnant girlfriend, and we actually hadn't told anybody. She was 4.5 months pregnant. We hadn't told anybody. Our plan was, after I graduated from high school, we were going to run away and get married and just leave the scene. But the more I started putting all that together, after I graduated, I went and got a job for like $2.60 an hour or something like that. I realized I don't have the money to do this. And so I told my parents, and like less than a month after I got out of high school, I was married, moving into an apartment, and trying to sort my way out. I was lost. That was 1970. In 1970, if you remember, the economy kind of collapsed. I mean, lots of factories were like laying off people. Everybody was getting laid off. So I had like 5 jobs in that first year. Just 2-bit jobs. I get a job, I lose it, get a job, lose it. I couldn't have been the way I worked, but it was mostly had to do with the economy at that time. And the last job that I got is kind of a miracle how I even got that job. The woman who worked in the office was an old girlfriend of mine and my brother's. And when I walked in there to get a job, she said, you don't have a job? She said, I'll get you an interview. I didn't even have to interview for the job. Next thing I know, I went there, I had a job. And they put me in a department that I wasn't trained for, I knew nothing about. They made missile casings there, and they put me in the X-ray lab. In the back of the place where I worked there, they put me in the X-ray lab, and the guy that was the supervisor of that department was a brand new Christian. And so he started sharing with me about Christ. But I was so hard, I was angry. I was angry with what had happened with my brother. I was angry with the Jesus movement. I had lots of negative encounters. So I said, don't even talk to me about that stuff. I don't want to hear it. Don't even talk to me about it. So he didn't. There was only 3 of us in that department. Our department, because it was X-ray, we were separated from the shop, so we had to have our lunches together. We really didn't relate to anybody else. And so he would talk to my partner back there. And Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, had just come out. So I'd sit there, eat my lunch, and we had a little fireplace there to keep us warm at night. And I'd be sitting out there listening to these guys talk about the late great planet Earth. And I really didn't want anything to do with it, but after listening to this night after night, finally I remember I turned to him, I said, give me that book. I want to read it. And I went home and I read that book. And what's so funny is that the parts about the second coming of Christ and the prophecies that were fulfilled weren't really the big deal for me. What was the big deal was the prophecies about Christ and hearing these words in that book, God loved me. And that was the issue, that I'd never heard that. I mean, maybe I heard it, but I never heard it. I mean, I go to church every Sunday as a child, I'd look up there and I'd see that cross in the church, but I never really understood how that was for me. And when I heard those words, God loved me, I mean, I literally, my heart melted. And I remember getting on my knees in my living room all by myself. I didn't have a church, I didn't have anybody but Richard. And I got on my knees in my living room and I told God, I said, God, if you love me this much, I'll give you my life. And my life came together right then. I knew all I ever wanted to do was to serve him with my life. And I gave him my life. I was 19 years old, had a baby, had a brand new family, that I was trying to figure out life. And God called me, and I knew the minute, that I got on my knees and accepted him into my life, I knew I was called to serve him. I had no idea what that was going to look like. The only church I'd ever been around was Catholics and Catholic priests. And so I had a whole journey with that. But it all started with understanding one thing: God loved me.